Orchids 101. Okay, so what are orchids? So in the plant world, of course, you know, everything is divided into all the different classifications. Well, orchids are classified by their special lips. They have a very unique lip, and each style of lip is unique to the different genera of orchids, but orchids are specifically classified because of their specialized lip. And most of the time they grow as epiphytes on trees, so they are not parasites. So because they grow on the side of a tree, their roots reach out and grip the bark, and they're up high enough in the tree that they get lots of breeze and lots of, you know, when the rain hits and the birds land and leave fertilizer, they thrive on the surface of the trees. So they are not parasites. Some are terrestrial and some are lithophytic, growing on limestone or different types of rocks, but mostly limestone. And they range from warm to cool growing, which is interesting because they are not all tropical and they're not all, you know, hothouse plants. So there's over 30,000 different species and counting, at least 800 genera, and over 300,000 hybrids. So the taxonomists are all the time arguing and lumping and splitting, so the number is kind of in flux about exactly how many there are. But they grow all over the world except in regions where snow is covers like the regions completely, and they're not in dry deserts. Of course, they're not in the Antarctic or Arctica or, you know, in very super cold regions, but they do grow in some temperate deserts and deserts that receive a little bit of water, but not super dry. And the size of the plant ranges, and the flowers can range from the size of a little tiny grain of rice to some flowers are humongous, like 10 inches across, like my hands. So they can be very variable because there's 30,000 species and hybrids. And some can also be very fragrant, and some have a unique characteristic of being fragrant at different times of the day. So some orchids that I'm going to show you later on are either day fragrant or a couple are night fragrant. So anyway, let's get to it. So the basic growing needs for orchids are kind of in this order. The proper light is important. So you need to have the right amount of light for the genus of the orchid that you're growing. So that encourages the plant to build up enough energy, internal energy, in order to have the oomph to be able to bloom. And then usually after it blooms, it either has a rest or it continues to regrow itself. So it's important to really get the plant pumped up so that it has the reserves in order to bloom. So watering ensures the wet or dry cycle. So because they grow on trees, they're subject to rain, and then the breeze comes and dries the roots again, and then the next day rains again, dries again. So they really like that cycling of wet to near dry, not bone dry. There's a few orchids that do require a dry or drier winter rest from like October to January or February, but those probably aren't going to be your first orchids that you're going to encounter. They also really like a temperature fluctuation between day and night. So if it's 90 during the day and, you know, 78 at night, that's perfect. They love a nice, at least 7-degree differentiation between the day temperature and nighttime. So they do like to cool off a little at night. And some of us who, you know, crank our thermostat down low at night, that's perfect. You know, it gets a little warmer during the day and cooler at night. They love that. And a lot of orchids also like a temperature difference between seasons, like summer and winter, for example. PHALAENOPSIS really like a little bit of cooling in the fall. We'll go over that when we get to the PHALAENOPSIS section. But, you know, so winter and summer temperatures can be a little bit different. Then it's also important to pot the plant properly, either in plastic or clay, and the potting medium depending on the plant that you're growing. And it's also important to make sure that you repot at the correct time. And if you're not sure about repotting, consult an expert. We're always happy to help at the Atlanta Orchid Society if you need help with the repotting. But the basic thing with the repotting is just when the plant is starting to initiate new growth is the ideal time to replant the orchid. If you wait until all the roots have completely grown and the plant is sort of resting, and then you repot it, the roots can become very stressed, and the plant can actually die with some of the more finicky orchids if you repot at the wrong time. And again, because orchids grow on the side of trees, they always have a lot of air movement. They have this buoyant air, it's buoyant, humid air that's constantly refreshing and bringing oxygen to the roots. So good air movement is important. If you're growing in your home, there's usually enough air movement with your heating and air conditioning blowing around. If not, you can use one of those little muffin fans, you know, those tiny little fans that you can put up and allow that to create a very slight breeze. You don't want it just blowing, you know, to dry it out too much. And then the thing that orchid people always say is when you fertilize once a week, weekly, and at a week concentration. So you can pretty much use any type of fertilizer. There's some orchids that really prefer balanced, or you can always switch to a bloom booster during certain times of the year. But if you just go with just a balanced where all the numbers are the same, 10, 10, 10, 20, 20, 20, etc. If it says 1 teaspoon per gallon on the container, do 1/4 of a teaspoon for your orchids. And then water a few times with the fertilizer, and then about once a month or so, just give the pot a really good flushing of water that releases all of the salts from the fertilizer that can build up on the roots and can burn the roots. So you really want to flush the pot monthly with just a lot of water. So I take mine to the sink, or you can take your hose and hose them down, okay? So a word about the water. In the Atlanta area, we have pretty good tap water. You can also use filtered water, reverse osmosis, rainwater, but don't ever use softened water because it contains salt. And salt is the enemy of orchid roots. It will kill them. And you really want to water each pot thoroughly until the water runs out from the bottom of the pot. And a lot of experienced growers water everything with plain water first, and then you wait a little while. Like for me, I water everything, then I go back to the beginning with my fertilizer, and then I fertilize on top of the water that I've just put down. And that helps really protect the roots, because if you think about it, orchid roots are a little bit sensitive. So if you let them get a little bit dry and then you fertilize them, it sort of shocks the roots and it can burn the roots a little bit. But if you water it first, the orchid says, okay, I'm ready to absorb the fertilizer that's coming next. So that's a good little trick to do. So we always get questions about the ice cubes. Ice cubes are not recommended for long-term sustainability of your orchids. So there's a company that's called the Ice Cube Orchid, and you know they recommend that you put the ice cube. So the theory behind it is that ice cubes are usually filtered water, so it's cleaner. Not a lot of crud that's in the water, like because it's been filtered. And it's the plants are usually potted in sphagnum moss generally, and so with sphagnum, you have to water a little differently than you do with bark. So sphagnum, if you soak sphagnum, it can take weeks for it to dissipate all of the water. So they recommend the ice cube so that you don't overwater the orchid, because you know most orchid murder, as you can see on the bottom, is caused by overwatering. The second reason is by underwatering, but usually if you overwater the plant, it can lead to root rot before you even know it. And don't leave plants standing in the water unless it has been recommended to you to take that plant and stand it in water. Certain things, but again, it's probably not going to be your first, 5 or 6 or 10 orchids. Like PHALAENOPSIS sometimes like to stand in water. But so at home when I water, I use a pump action sprayer, just like you'd spray pesticide in your garden, but I never use the one I use for pesticide on my orchids. I have one. Actually, I have 3 because I'm an orchid fanatic. So I have them all dedicated, for the orchids, and they're great. You just pump it up, you spray everything, and it's easy to maintain the orchids that way, okay? And then where do you buy orchids? I recommend that you buy orchids if you want the orchids to live for a long time. And orchids can live indefinitely as long as they have their needs required and they don't succumb to disease. A lot of orchids have the genetics that they can live for years. I have a division of a piece of a plant that has been growing for 60, 70, and one that's been growing for over 80 years. So they can continue to grow as long as you take care of them. So I recommend that you buy from where we buy stuff. So you can also buy from orchid shows, garden centers like Pike's, and Atlanta has a lot of nice little garden centers, or like Habersham, or nice little things like that. You can also buy things at the Lowe's and the Home Depots, the home improvement stores, and grocery stores. But again, as much as I love the lost causes, I would recommend that you really try and resist buying the half dead or almost dead plants from the grocery store bargain bin, because they're so far behind the 8-ball that it's going to take them so much in order to recover that you really kind of have to put them in a little plant hospital. Sometimes I stick the plant down in a Ziploc bag. You kind of moisten it a little bit and stick it in the bag, and you almost zip up the bag so that just a little bit of air gets in, and that kind of builds up some humidity right around the plant. But you know, some of those orchids that are in the bargain bin are there for a reason. So if they have a disease and you bring it home, it can give your other plants a disease. I have a girlfriend that bought so many orchids from the Kroger near her, and one of them had some big bad funk and it killed all the rest of her Phalaenopsis. So she cried and never did that again. So, and you can also buy things from the internet, but just be aware when you're buying online. Like on eBay, for example, check their feedback, specifically their negative feedback. If a lot of people are having trouble with the plants, or if customers say that they have no roots, it's really hard sometimes to reclaim an orchid that doesn't have roots or is already run down. So you want to get good, healthy plants. I always quarantine my orchids after I buy them. So in case they have some little pesky pests down inside between the leaves that you can't see, I like to isolate them from the rest of my collection so that if there is an issue, I can address just one plant instead of the 200 that I have. So it makes life a lot easier. And then I never repot right away. I let the plant kind of adjust a little bit, because one of the main issues that people have with orchids is, you know, the life of a Phalaenopsis, for example, it's grown under ideal conditions in a greenhouse, and it's got the right humidity and the buoyant air and the perfect fertilizer, and it produces this beautiful bloom spike with lots of buds and flowers on it. And then as soon as it's ready and it's happy and ready to bloom, it gets thrown in a box, shipped on a truck for goodness knows how long, shipped to the grocery store, of course, left in the back room, and then they take it out of the box and they stick it on the shelf near the door where the heat and the cold come in and out and all the people coming by and handling. And then you decide you like that particular one and you bring it home and you bring it into your kitchen. So the orchid has to go through this tremendous transition from an ideal condition to our conditions. So, you know, help your plants a little bit, you know, give them a little bit of TLC when you get them home. Okay. So these are some of the more commonly available orchids. So we have Phalaenopsis, or the moth orchid. I'm going to be showing you a little blurb on each one of these as the talk goes on. So the Phalaenopsis, or moth orchid, Oncidium, normally we see Oncidium hybrids at the store. We very, very seldom see species. And PAPHIOPEDILUMS, or slipper orchids. I have new and old world types. So the old world types are called PAPHIOPEDILUMS, like that first big Paph Rothschildianum that I showed in the very first the slide at the beginning. The New World types are called Phragmipediums, and they look very similar. They also have the big pouch, and sometimes they have these big long droopy petals or unique colors. There's a little hot red one. This is a little mini Phragmipedium. See if you can see that. Isn't that cute? That's just a little cutie pie. So this is a New World slipper orchid, as opposed to the, oopsie, the Old World slipper orchids. Okay. Sometimes you'll see dendrobiums, Dendrobium phalaenopsis, we call them denphals. And then there's also another type of dendrobium called nobile type. But sometimes they're called cane orchids because they have a very long, distinct cane that comes up with leaves on the sides. The nobile types have flowers all along the sides. You'll see pictures of that. And the denphals have the flower spike. It looks a little like a phalaenopsis that comes out of the top of the cane. A lot of times you'll see Miltoniopsis or pansy orchids at the grocery stores. And sometimes at the Lowe's and Home Depot, you'll see Brassavola nodosa. There's not that many Brassavolas, so nodosa is kind of a single, but there's lots of little hybrids made with Brassavola nodosa, and it's very powerfully fragrant at night. It's just absolutely wonderful and very easy to grow. Sometimes you'll see cymbidiums. I've seen big cymbidium pots at the store, and I'm just stunned. You know, it's a big gallon pot and all this big grass, 2-3 feet tall, growing out of it, and a big flower spike. And sometimes you'll also see Cattleyas, but usually you'll see Cattleyas more at a specialty place, like a specialized orchid nursery or some kind of a higher end place. I haven't seen too many of them at the Lowe's and the Home Depot that are already potted and ready to go. Usually you see them in those little net bags. They come from Hawaii and they're like a little net bag with a little label on the top that shows the picture of them, but you do see those occasionally. And but once or twice a year, Lowe's and Home Depot will have Vandas or Vanda type orchids. Again, I'll show you pictures of all of these. And then there's the native orchids and terrestrials. There's one called a BLETILLA. That's a lovely little terrestrial orchid. It comes from China, but you can grow it here. It's growing all over the place at the botanical gardens in Atlanta as a kind of a ground cover. But we do have some native orchids, but I really don't recommend transplanting wild orchids unless they're getting ready to get bulldozed for a housing development or something. But they're very finicky and very difficult to establish when you try and transplant them home. Okay. All right, so Phalaenopsis. This is your ubiquitous Phalaenopsis. You see these everywhere. So this is a variety of sizes of Phalaenopsis. This little guy up here, these are, I think, did I bring this one over? No, it's still sitting over on my other side. Anyway, it's a fairly small flowered, but it's got, 30 or 40 flowers on it. It's really lovely. And they come in different forms of spots and different lips. There's a lovely pink one here behind me with the white lip. This is just a really lovely Phalaenopsis, and they come in all kinds of patterns and shapes. Some of these are a little more specialty orchids, like these guys right here in the middle. But you'll see these all over, and they range in sizes from the small multiflorals to the great big ubiquitous white orchid that you see absolutely everywhere. Okay, so starting with Phalaenopsis, we're going to talk a little bit about how to grow the Phalaenopsis. So you bring it home from your grocery store and you set it up in your really sunny window, and it probably gets sunburned. So Phalaenopsis need a little bit of shading. So an east window or a shaded south or west, depends on the time of the year and how much sunlight comes through your windows. I generally grow my Phalaenopsis in a south window, but I have built-in shading in my windows, like low E, high R windows that have it automatically helps protect them from sunburn. It's like having a curtain that you can see through, or window tinting on your car, sort of like that. So they like partial shade. They like to be moist, but not sopping wet. So again, because they grow on the side of trees, they like that cycle of getting wet. And as the water runs through the pot, it pulls the oxygen down into the pot, which the roots love. And then it can get a little bit drier. You don't want it to get bone dry, because then you'll start losing some of the plant. The Phalaenopsis have no water storage organs. So if you don't water them for a little while, it'll start desiccating the roots and the leaves. So I think the easiest thing to do, it takes a little bit of practice, but it's really not that hard, is to heft the pot. So pick it up and feel it when it's dry. It should be fairly lightweight when it's dry. And you can tell it's dry. You can take a pencil, not a sharpened one, just like a dull pointed wooden pencil, and you can poke it a couple inches down into the mix, or take your finger and poke it in there. If you feel moist but not wet, like if you stick the pencil in there and pull it out and the pencil wood part is wet, you probably don't need to water it quite yet. So when you heft the pot and lift it, the more water that's in the pot will make the pot heavier. So you can kind of check it before you water, should be kind of lighter in weight, and after you water it, it should be heavier. So it's retaining water. So that's really the best way to tell. And also later in the program, I'll talk about using clear plastic pots. That really gives you an idea of how much water is inside of the pot. But hefting the pot is really the best way to assess the moisture level, in my opinion. And they also like humidity of 35% or higher. In our homes, usually in the summertime, we have a little more humidity than in the winter. If you have a lot of static electricity and you get shocked on everything in the wintertime in your house, you probably don't have enough humidity for orchids to grow happily. So there's other things that you can do to add humidity, like use a humidifier or a pebble tray. I'll talk about that later. I'll show you my grow setup in the pictures. So. But they really need to get at least 35% humidity. I mean, they can get down to 25 or so, but you try to want to give them a little bit more than that. You can buy those little, it's a maximum, minimum thermometer. It's just a little cheapo thing that gives you the temperature and the humidity. I buy them I buy like a dozen every few years from China, and then you throw the batteries in and then they go defunct, and then you either replace the batteries or you put a new one in, and you can then tell your temperature, because again, you want that temperature differentiation between day and night and fall and winter. One of the things that Phalaenopsis really like is to get cool for about 2 to 3 weeks in the fall. So if you have a cool room that you can leave the window open a little bit into the fall, at night they love to get down into the high 50s, and that will help set their little buds for the following spring. So orchids are considered fairly slow growing. So the cool treatment that you give it in the fall will initiate bloom spikes in the spring. So it takes from October, November, December, January, February before the little bloom buds, the little bloom spikes will start poking their little noses out from between the leaf axils. So you want to give it a little bit of time to be able to go through that process of the bud initiation. And again, that's one that likes the cooler in the winter or fall and warmer in the summer. And I recommend the clear pot, especially if you're growing at home. If you have a greenhouse, it's different because you can maintain higher humidity all the time. But home growers, I recommend the clear plastic pot so you can see what's going on inside of the pot. Okay? So they also need moderate air movement, not a ton of blowing. You know, you don't want their to be blowing their hair back, but you want them to have enough air motion. And again, with our heating and air conditioning vent, that should be enough with that. But I do run a little fan after I water, just to make sure that none of the moisture stays inside of the little top crown of the plant. That's a prime area for rot, is down inside the little crown. Let's see. Ouch. I've lost a leaf on this one, but oopsie. You don't want water to get trapped down inside of here. If you do, you can just take a paper towel and just dab it out and run your little fan so that it dries off, because you really don't want, oopsie. Moisture to stay in there, because that can lead to rot. And again, for the budding, you give it 2 to 3 weeks cooler temperature in October. And again, you give the weekly balanced fertilizer. And it's always better to go with urea-free fertilizers. And I have some other, my little Gesneriads here. They're really ideal companion plants for Phalaenopsis. If you can bloom African violets in the location, then that's enough light to bloom Phalaenopsis, okay? Next ones, oncidiums are some of the things that you see fairly often. Now this gorgeous one on the right here, this is a little bit more advanced. You probably won't find that one too often at the Lowe's or the Home Depot, but you might, you know. They come in different varieties. Sometimes they call them dancing ladies. And there's usually, this one here has tiny little fragrant flowers. This one and this one, these two make big tall sprays of just multitudes of flowers. There's a very common one that you might see a lot called Sherry Baby Sweet Fragrance. It's a little red one, kind of a burgundy red, and it has just this delicious, almost chocolatey flavor of the fragrance. It's just absolutely wonderful. So oncidiums are another really good first orchid to try, and pretty much most of the oncidium species that you're going to encounter at your, you know, outside of a specialty nursery are going to be fairly easy to grow. Okay, so with the oncidiums, again, they like bright shade, south or west window, and shade is necessary. You can look at their leaves to determine if they need more shade or more sun. If they're really kind of going yellow or yellow on the tips, then they're probably getting a little too much sun. Then with water, they like to be moist, not drying out, 30 to 60% humidity. So just a little bit more humidity than Phalaenopsis, especially when they're forming the bloom spike and the buds, because the little buds need some humidity to keep them from sticking so that they can open properly. So if you want to run a little humidifier at the time that they're just spiking, that's good. So they're considered intermediate growers. So the temperatures that we like, 85 down to whatever it says on my screen, I can't see behind the column here, but about 50 to 60. And then you pot in the plastic pot with fine bark or New Zealand sphagnum. You see a lot of them grown in the New Zealand sphagnum. I like the sphagnum, but it's kind of problematic because one day it's fine and the next day it breaks down and it becomes very acidic. So, you know, that's going to involve some repotting, but we'll talk about that a little bit more later. And then as soon as the growth matures with oncidiums, they can throw a bloom spike. So they can bloom any time of year. Whereas Phalaenopsis, for example, different Phalaenopsis bloom at different times of the year. Sometimes the growers force Phalaenopsis so they can have the beautiful red ones at Christmas, and they can force them into bloom just like forcing a bulb so that you get the beautiful white ones at Easter and the, you know, pink ones at Valentine's Day. But generally speaking, Phalaenopsis will bloom either in the spring or in the fall, depending on the species that are in there. But with oncidiums, they can bloom anytime that the growth has matured. And again, the weekly fertilizer with the flush. All right, so these are PAPHIOPEDILUMS. So I'm a slipper girl. So these are my favorite genus of orchids. And some of these are not very beginning level orchids, but you will see a lot of times some slippers that are easier to grow. They'll have very mottled leaves, like, let's see these leaves that are really pretty. They're so this type of orchid, slipper orchid, here's the flower. These are warm growing. They're very easy, very tolerant, and you can buy these online. You can buy them at, sometimes you can see them at the garden centers, but they're considered very easy to grow, whereas some of these other ones involve a little bit more of a winter rest or cooler temperatures in winter or drier in winter, but they are so rewarding and I absolutely love them. This is one of my favorites here in the middle, and it's fairly easy to grow on a windowsill. They get very tall and have multiple bloom spikes, which is really scrumptious. So with the slipper orchids, the mottle leaf types, like I showed you, prefer a little bit more warmth, whereas the one like at the very beginning of the lecture, I had the picture of the Path Rothschildianum in the middle. Those can take the cooler temperatures. And again, there's 30,000 different species of orchids, so there's not going to be one growing recommendation for all PAPHIOPEDILUMS or all oncidiums or all Phalaenopsis. So you kind of have to tweak what you're doing a little bit to suit the orchid. Again, they're going to be a little bit lower light than the Phalaenopsis. They like to stay moist, so don't let them dry out. The temperature is variable, generally high 80s to sometimes into the low 50s. And you can also, I recommend the plastic pots for home growers because they do retain a little bit more moisture. And I use orchid bark. Now I use fancy orchid bark, but they make some decent orchid barks that you can get at the Lowe's and the Home Depots and the garden centers and things like that. And then the flowers tend to mature or to initiate after the fan has matured. So orchids have two basic ways that they grow. Sympodial is where there's sort of a runner along the top of the pot and then a shoot comes up like a stem or a cane. And then the next shoot will come off of that one. It might have two and split going up. And so they will grow horizontally along the pot. Things like PHALAENOPSIS, again, grow vertically. They're called monopodial. So they grow new leaves out the top, like VANDAS. They'll continue to grow out the top, and they can just keep going up and up and up indefinitely. So with PAPHIOPEDILUMS, they don't like to dry, and you want to have a big enough pot to accommodate at least 1 or 2 years growth in the pot. They are sympodal, so a new growth will come out just tucked in between the next, between the leaves of the currently blooming fan or the mature fan. They don't require as much humidity as certain other orchids, so 35 to 50, and I use humidity trays. Again, I'll show you my setup. The temperature, high 80s, down into the 50s for some of them, a moderate air movement, and more when the temperatures are high. And then again, the fan blooms, and then the higher nitrogen, and they like that flush. They are more subject to root sensitivity if you over-fertilize and don't flush the pots to get rid of the extra salt. Okay, so these are all dendrobiums, and some of these dendrobiums, this is the dendrobium phalaenopsis. It looks a lot like a phalaenopsis, so it has a tall cane, and then the flower spike comes out of the top of the cane. These you see a lot of times at the Lowe's and the Home Depots. And then there's these smaller canes here. This white one is called the nobile type. So you can see the cane of the orchid, and the flowers just grow right out of the side of the cane. So if you have this type, the dendrobium nobile type, those require a winter rest. So I quit watering mine about October, and once they start, I see little buds starting to poke out, then I can start watering again. And there's all these different oddball weird ones. This is a tiny little miniature. This whole plant is in a little 2-inch pot, so it's a very tiny little thing. And then you see a lot of these beautiful miniature dendrobiums, and occasionally you see those at the garden centers too, and they're fun. They don't really require anything special to grow them, but you do want to research the type of dendrobium that you have. So you can go online and look and see. So it's important to buy a plant that has a name. You know, if you don't know what the name is, or you can't get anybody to tell you what type of dendrobium it is, you really don't know how to create an ideal growing situation for it. They generally like a little bit higher light, and they like to stay evenly moist, except for the nobile types, which like the winter rest as mentioned. And they can be intermediate temperature, but they do like a big difference between day and night, but they can't get colder than 50 degrees. It will blast the buds, and you will not get flowers, and you might kill the plant too. And 50 degrees doesn't seem like that cold, but you know, anyway, they're hothouse plants. So moderate air movement and the 55 degrees and balanced fertilizer, okay? So you'll see Miltoniopsis sometimes in the fall. These are beautiful things. They tend to be a little bit cooler growing. They have these lovely waterfall patterns on the lips, and they have some of them have quite a powerful fragrance. Most of the orchids so far I've shown you have come from my collection of things that I've actually grown on my windowsill, but not these. They require a little bit cooler temperature than what I can give them, but I still try. So they like bright shade, a little bit brighter than a phalaenopsis. evenly moist, but they require a lot more humidity. So these are things that you would definitely need to have supplemental humidity. Later, I'm going to show you what accordion leaves look like when they get too dry. And I pot mine in plastic with fine fir bark. A lot of times at the store, if you buy them, they come already in sphagnum moss. You just have to be careful with the sphagnum moss and repot them after they bloom. Moderate air movement, and they'll bud in season when the growths mature. Again, same weekly with the fertilizer, flush monthly. So this is a cute little plant called BRASSAVOLA, this one here in the middle. This is the species. So there's the other two are hybrids. So sometimes you'll see the pictures if they look like this general sort of heart-shaped lip, and sometimes they have the little spotting. These actually have little spotting down in the lips. This is the Lady of the Night orchids. And this is considered very easy to grow. This was one of my first orchids that I got to bloom, and it rewards you with this just heady, perfumey fragrance at night. It's just absolutely wonderful. They're pollinated by moths, so they have a little tube, and that's why they're white and night fragrant, to attract their pollinators at night. So they take a little bit higher light than a PHALAENOPSIS. So either put it closer to the window or in a southern or western exposure. They like to stay moist, a little bit higher humidity also, and they like to be a little bit warmer than some. Sometimes you'll see them mounted on a wooden slab or in a on like a little twig, or looks like a piece of stick or something. As a home grower, I personally have a little trouble with that because I can't get enough water in to maintain the humidity. So if you have one that's mounted on a wood slab or a little pot, you can put that inside of a clay pot, and then water and wet the clay pot, and the clay pot, as the water evaporates out of the clay, can provide a little supplemental humidity for your mounted piece. And we have some really good growers in our Atlanta Orchid Society that are indoor growers, and they, instead of having the little mounts vertical, they put them horizontal, so it allows the moisture to stay in there a little bit more. So good air movement and humidity, summer blooms, very fragrant at night, and then the balanced fertilizer year round. Okay. So cymbidiums. I don't grow a lot of cymbidiums. I grew this one here, and it's lovely and fragrant. It's actually a miniature cymbidium, and it's very fragrant and wonderful. The whole plant is about maybe 1.5 foot tall, something like that. But some of these cymbidiums can get absolutely humongous. So we know all these pictures. I'm just giving you a sampling of some that you might encounter in your normal garden center routes. So with cymbidiums, again, you want to do the research. Some, especially for the Atlanta area, I recommend some that are warmth tolerant. We have people that grow cymbidiums by the droves, but they let them stay outside in the fall until it almost gets to frost temperatures, down into the 40s. They like that cool, almost really just cold during that fall, and that initiates the bloom spike. They like a little more light and cooler temperatures, evenly moist, moderate humidity, intermediate temperatures, but they do like a little bit cooler in the evening. And it's also important with cymbidiums to not overpot them, meaning they like to be a little bit cramped in their pot. So if you buy a cymbidium, usually it's going to be in a plastic pot, and you can actually see the ridges on the outside of the pots where the roots are just growing in. They make a lot of root mass, surprisingly a lot. So they're really tight and firm inside of the pot. So they really like that closeness inside. So you want to let them go every 2 years before repotting them with orchid bark. And moderate air movement, and then the 50 to 60 degrees or cooler in the fall to bloom. And cymbidiums, because they have a lot of greenery, they can take the high nitrogen in the spring, so the first number being higher than the other two, and then the bloom booster, which is the middle number, higher in the summertime, can initiate some of the blooms. All right, How are we doing on time? So Cattleyas. A lot of things, at times you'll see like this little orange Cattleya over here. You'll see these in the little mesh bags. And sometimes you'll see other Cattleyas inside of the little mesh bags at the Lowe's and the Home Depots. A couple of these, like this one, is a species. It's a little specialty. And this is a Cattleya. Well, these are all hybrids, of course, well, except for the species here. But this is a Cattleya relative. So Cattleyas are the queen of orchids. They are absolutely stunning. They bloom for 2 to 3 to 4 weeks per year. And some can bloom twice a year, but it's a little bit difficult under home situations to get them to bloom twice a year. But they have these big, thick pseudobulbs. They're called pseudobulbs. It's like a big, thick cane that comes up, and then 1 or 2 leaves that comes out the top of the cane. And usually associated with the leaf, there's a sheath. So it's a little flat looking. It looks sort of like a little, those little pea pod. It looks like a little pea pod almost growing out of the top, little flat, like a snow pea growing out of the top of the leaf. And then you'll see the little buds eventually pushing their way up through the sheath. Okay. So with Cattleyas, they're going to be the highest light, except for the Vandas. They like a lot of sunlight, but again, not direct sun. If they get the direct sun, they can get sunburned just like people can. Then you get these big black ugly splotches on your leaves. And Cattleyas are some that really like to cycle between wet and dry also. It's really important, especially if you have a big Cattleya, to water it and let it get almost dry, not completely bone dry, but let it get nearly dry before watering again. Constant moisture at the roots of a Cattleya will kill it. And the humidity, 50 to 80%, especially when they're setting, once you see the buds start, that's the time to really maintain a higher humidity if you can. And they range in temperatures as well, from 75 to 85 during the day and 55 to 60 at night. So there's a temperature range, again, depending on the type of Cattleya that you're growing. But generally the ones that we're going to see are going to be in the intermediate range, like the same temperatures that we're comfortable living in our homes. And these are some of the finicky ones that if you repot these at the wrong time, they can really suffer. So, you know, it has a rhizome that comes out, and then you'll see this little bud and it will shoot up. Then after the little the new pseudobulb starts to rise, you'll see some little roots emerging from the bottom. As soon as you see evidence of the little roots starting to poke through, that's the ideal time to pot your Cattleyas. If you wait until they get too long, they won't adapt to the potting mix, and they're too easy to break. And once they break, they're no good to the plant anymore. So you basically have a plant with no roots. So that's one that you really want to repot carefully, usually in the springtime, right at the beginning of the growth phase. They like good air movement with humidity, and then the sheaths will form at maturity, and then the buds emerge. Again, high nitrogen weekly with bloom booster in the summer. Okay, and Vandas. So I've never had much luck with Vandas, so I didn't grow any of these, but I love them. They're the closest to some of the blue orchids, or blurple, you know, that blue purple color that I love so much. This picture down here is from an orchid show down in Florida, in Homestead, Florida at Redlands. And they just come in a dizzying array of just these scrumptious colors. But when you look at the growing conditions they need very high light. So a lot of people in Florida grow them outside right in full sun with very little shading, maybe a little shading during the hottest part of the day. They like a lot of watering, but then they want the roots to dry quickly. They like the very high 80% humidity. So, you know, people in Florida grow these, you know, like gangbusters, but it's a little bit harder to maintain them in the winter time here. They do great in the summer, but it's when you bring them inside in the winter that if they don't have the proper humidity, it prevents the little roots from being able to grow. And if the roots don't operate, it's not feeding the plant. The plant will go through a significant decline in the winter months which is usually what mine do until they just turn into very expensive compost. So with budding, they bloom in spring and summer on mature plants. And so if you buy some of these at Lowe's and Home Depot or garden centers, if you buy them when they're not in bloom, and sometimes it can take 3 and 4 years for the plant to reach maturity, because these plants can get quite large and they will continue to grow out of the top. Let me show you the next thing here. They'll continue to grow out of the top of this indefinitely. So you can have a lot of greenery coming out the top. So this is a technique that people that have a little bit more success growing vandas. They do this little, either like a fishbowl or some type of like a columnar shaped glass. So you water down inside of it, and then it kind of keeps that humidity in and around the roots. So it's a great way of keeping up the humidity, because they really like that humidity. So we call that a vanda glass or vanda cylinder. How are we doing time-wise? Okay. And then there's these terrestrials. So you just, this is BLETILLA, striata, albas, and then there's some different color forms there. And these grow outside. So you want to just make sure and plant them in a nice woodland setting, but not too much sun. You can see them all around at the botanical gardens, and you fertilize them just like you would fertilize your other woodland type plants. And they are hardy in the south. And you want to avoid disturbing the roots too much in the late fall and winter. You can break off the new growth very easily, and then you'll lose all your blooms for spring. Okay, so the humidity boost that I do is, if you look, this is my growing conditions. This is actually my home. So I have some big bay windows that, okay, I'm a fanatic. I'm remodeling my house. I needed new windows anyway, so I put in these nice big bay windows to have room specifically to grow my plants. So I have the low E, high R windows that have built-in shading in the window, so it doesn't transmit 100% of the light. It transmits about, depending on which window, 60 to 70% of the light. So it has the blocking ability. But you can see I use this egg crate material here. These are just these little cheapo plastic things that you can buy for kitchen silverware and stuff for your kitchen drawers. And I've just bought this lighting. It's called egg crate material. They put it over the fluorescent lighting fixtures, and you can just take a pair of scissors or wire cutters and nip it to fit down inside. So this one down here is essentially the same type of thing. So it's just a big plastic bin, and I have some lava rock. You can use gravel in the bottom, and this is the plastic privacy lattice that is available. The plastic, because it doesn't rot, and I just took my saw and I cut it to fit. You put the gravel in the bottom, you put the lattice on the top so that the plants aren't sitting in water. Same with the little mesh, the little egg crate up here. Water drains down through, so there's a little layer of moisture on the bottom that evaporates and provides extra humidity. Also, because I'm a fanatic, if you grow a lot of plants, the plants just being in proximity to each other will also boost the humidity just with that aspect. So this is a great little system for what I do. And here's my little kitchen window. So you can see I have all these, it doesn't look like it's really showing up that much, but there's all these little containers that I line up on my kitchen window. So I have like a running show all the time. You see my faucet there. It's my little running show on my kitchen sink. And then for summer, I put them outside. They really enjoy the summering outside. So you can see down here in the foreground, I have Cattleyas here. I have my PHALAENOPSIS here. And then I have a ton of slippers and some little things in baskets and things going around. So they'll have, if you can see here, there's some of this egg crate material. So nothing is sitting in water. It's just sitting on those fold out plastic tables, just the general type of table. You can just stick it out there. You can put a piece of window screen over it just to elevate the plants just a little bit off of the table so that when the water drains, it has somewhere to go. It kind of channels it outward. Then I just water them with the hose. I just spray them down every day and fertilize. They love that. So things that you can do to improve your growing skills, not trying to pump our society, but joining an orchid society, you can meet other people that are orchid fanatics that can help you. I mean, I'm here helping. I love to help other people because orchids are so rewarding. To me, they're almost like having a pet. You know, they really respond to the love and the attention that you give them. So joining a society, we meet the second Monday of every month. So our meeting will be coming up this coming Monday. And you do have to join to watch our Zoom meetings, but we're going to be having an interesting talk on cymbidiums this month. And the next month we have a PAPHIOPEDILUM guy. Yay, I'm so excited for that. But you can also subscribe to the American Orchid Society, and that's a terrific resource. The American Orchid Society, just Google them. They have culture sheets on all of the different orchids and then some that I've been talking about today. So they are the national authority on everything orchid here in this country. They also have a magazine, so I read the magazine and the books. Go to orchid nurseries and just go see what's out there, see how they're being grown. Talk to the orchid owners, you know, the nursery owners. Go to shows. Unfortunately, you can't do that this year because all the shows have been canceled, but normally we have orchid shows. And then you can always go to the Atlanta Botanical Garden. I'm sure the Botanical Garden in Athens has orchids as well. At least they have some terrestrial ones, I'm sure. But you can see some of the orchids growing. It's very interesting. And then talking with other growers. And you can also watch some stuff on YouTube. But just the caveat with YouTube is that there's a lot of people that don't know what they're talking about, and they give very false information. Again, my girlfriend watches these YouTube videos, and these hobby people sometimes don't give really good sound advice. So watch YouTube videos from known people that are professional orchid growers or associated with a nursery, rather than somebody that just watches videos and tries to pretend like they're an expert. Sorry, I hope I didn't hurt anybody's feelings, but anyway, and don't give up if you kill a few in the process, especially if you buy the bargain bin plants. You know, they're already half dead anyway, so, you know, not all orchids live forever. Some are just genetically not designed to live that long. So 3 or 4 or 5 years, and then poof, they're done, you know, but others can grow for generations. So it's important to learn a little bit of orchidese, talking about how to read your plants. So when you look at this accordion leaf, we call this accordion leaf. If you see any evidence of things like this, that means the plant is very dry and lacking humidity, and the leaf can actually get stuck in there. It tries to grow and it gets stuck in between, which is why it does that accordion. So that's a classic example of not having enough humidity. This one here on the bottom shows a very desiccated PHALAENOPSIS leaf. That can be an indication of overwatering, which is again why most orchids die from overwatering rather than underwatering. And so you can sometimes put the plant in the plastic bag and create a little humid environment for it until it can recover after a few weeks. And then this one on the right is actually my orchid that got a disease, and you can see that horrible yellowing and spotting, looks terrible. But the new leaf coming out of the center, I treated it with Physan, which is down here on this bottom list, Physan 20. You can get that from Amazon or eBay or most good orchid growers. And you read the label, you mix it up according to the label, you can dunk the plant in that, and it can kill those funguses and bacteria and things. So you also want to look at the color of the leaves. If your PHALAENOPSIS leaves are really deep and dark green, that means they're trying to attract as much sunlight as possible. If they're really bright green or have kind of purple spotting, that means they're almost like they have a suntan. They're reaching the absolute maximum of what they can tolerate. If they have little purple dots or purple edges, or if the leaves are very kind of almost bleached looking. So you want the leaves to be a nice light green, like this one growing out of the top of this orchid here. All right, so if you see issues on the leaves, pop the plant out of the pot and check the roots, because that's usually where the issue is with the roots. If you get root rots, it will turn the leaves yellow. So the next thing is that I get the question a lot, oh, my orchid is dropping leaves. Well, if it's dropping leaves at the bottom of the plant, at the base, like down in this area, the lowest leaves, then that could be the normal senescence of the leaves. The leaves don't live forever. They'll grow for a while, allow the leaf to turn yellow. The nutrients from the leaf will come back into the plant, that will get absorbed into the plant, and then the leaf will naturally break off, a very clean break, just like leaves do in the fall. They break off naturally. So I would avoid cutting the leaves off to let the plant absorb those nutrients. And look for pests, little fine webs over the surface. Those are all pests, and white fluff. Again, you can go to the American Orchid Society and look at some of the pests there. Home remedies, very quickly, we're getting near the end here. In a quart sprayer, 2 tablespoons of dish soap like Dawn or Joy, not dishwasher soap, a couple cups of alcohol in a quart spray bottle. And if you see any funky little pests, just go ahead and spray it with that. You can also use hydrogen peroxide or dilute Lysol. Mouthwash or cinnamon can help prevent rots. And if you see a problem with the plant, isolate it immediately so it doesn't affect the rest of your plants. And I hate to do it, but sometimes you have to cull your diseased or dying plants so that they don't kill the rest of your collection. Clean your cutting tools. If you use a pair of scissors to cut off a leaf, swipe it with alcohol before you cut the leaf off of another plant, in case you don't want to bring a disease from one plant to your next one. So these are things that are very reasonably safe to do in your home without having the big guns for chemicals. And quickly, the clear pots are recommended for growers at home so you can see the moisture in the pot. You can put the clear pot into a clay pot if you have a top-heavy plant, but I really don't recommend clay pots because they tend to draw the moisture out of the plant. And as a home grower, we struggle with maintaining the humidity. Oh gosh, I'm going over. Clean pots, organize them by watering. Try and keep everything in the same type of potting mix so that it's easier to process, and repot every 2 years. So you choose the orchid bark by the size of the roots. If you have thin, small roots or small plants, you want small pieces of bark. If you have bigger plants like the PHALAENOPSIS with the big thick roots, you want bigger, chunkier bark. Okay. And then there's these other companies on the bottom that are just a few of the locations where you can buy the potting mix. So the tips for success, one of the things that I do is I grow orchids that are suited to my conditions. And you want to modify your conditions by adding humidity or shade to suit your orchids. Research, just look up the name of the orchid and see if you can find some information on how to grow that plant. Buy the healthy plants, not the half-dead bin plants. Get the largest plants you can so that you don't have to wait 10 years for it to bloom, because you want to get to the bloom as quickly as possible, and give them time to adjust to your conditions. I take delight in watching the new leaves grow out the top and the new roots. You want to protect them from drafts, harsh sun, and ripening fruit. So if you have a bunch of a bowl of apples right underneath your Phalaenopsis, you'll notice that in the next couple of days your Phalaenopsis will start to wilt because of the ethylene gas will blast the buds. And then consider summering them outdoor, and never water them with softened water, and allow the leaves to dry before nightfall. Okay, so this is kind of a fun little sequence. This is a specialty plant. This is Bulbophyllum medusa, but the bud was just so fascinating to see how it unfurled and elongated. So professional growers have hundreds of these blooms on a plant, but this plant is small. So these are all PAPHIOPEDILUMS that I've grown. These two on the right, this one and this one, I actually got American Orchid Society awards on. And this one got a ribbon at our society. When people bring the plants in, you get ribbons. So this is my little kitchen window show at sunset. Some of the little scenes that I enjoy. All right, this orchid is amazing. Look, it's the size of my hand. So enjoy the rewards. And on this right in the back here, you can see a little deer behind my chicken house, which is kind of funny. So You can watch your deer to the behind the backdrop of orchids. Okay, and then you can be inspired by orchids. So this is what I do in my real life: is I make jewelry. So there you go. I'm inspired by my orchids. So, any questions?
Yes. So we have a couple of questions.
Alrighty.
The first one was, which varieties are considered the best for starters?
Phalaenopsis.
Phalaenopsis.
Oncidium. In the order that I showed them, those are the easiest things to do. So Phalaenopsis, Oncidium, Dendrobiums, those are the generally recommended. Brassavola nodosa, if you can find it. It's got leaves that look like little round terete leaves, like pencil. They're long and narrow.
The next person asks, when is a good time to cut the flower spikes?
Oh, good. I knew that was going to be a question. Yeah. All right. So with Phalaenopsis, well, with pretty much most, or specifically with Phalaenopsis, because they're a little bit different than a lot of the other ones. If it looks still green and healthy and alive, I wouldn't cut it. If it's starting to dry off, it usually dries off from the tip and it'll dry down. If the whole flower stem turns dry and desiccated, cut it off. So there are some things that you can do. There's little nodes. Let's see if I can show this one. Oops, I'm trying to find my orchid here. There's little nodes. Oops. If you can see this one here. So these little things here, can you see these little things? These are called nodes. So this one has actually created a branching spike from here. You can sort of see that coming out from here. And same with this one. You see let's see if I can get the angle of that. So the original bloom spike was here, and I didn't cut it off, and it automatically grew itself a whole second, I guess you can see that, a whole second little shoot off of the main stem. So as long as it stayed green, I left it, and the plant will kind of do its own thing by either continuing to grow. Some people cut it above the second node. So if this is the first node here, see if you can see that. First node here and second, you can cut it above the second node, about 1/2 to 3/4 of an inch above that node, and it could resprout from there. But as long as it's looking nice and healthy, I would leave it. Same with the roots. And Phalaenopsis produce a lot of aerial roots too.
Well, that was actually my next question. We have a person that asks, is it good to put all the new roots inside the pot when you repot it, or?
That's a really good question, and one that took me years to learn. So because Phalaenopsis and a lot of orchids grow on the side of trees as epiphytes, they have aerial roots, and they have roots that are specialized, like they will grow specific roots to grow into the potting mix in order to absorb the nutrients from the potting mix. If you have aerial roots and you moisten them and try and cram them down into the pot, they will die because they are specifically aerial roots and not pot roots. So if you've ever unpotted a Phalaenopsis like that's been in sphagnum moss, you'll usually see the aerial roots on the top. And once you've removed some of the sphagnum moss, you'll see these bigger, thicker, kind of yellower. They don't have the little silvery vellum on the surface of the root. And so the pot roots are different than aerial roots. So the short answer is no. Do not cram those in the pot. Let them be up and open. You can cut them back if they get really long and crazy. Usually they're seeking moisture.
And then my final question I have this evening is, have you ever made your own keiki paste?
No.
I know those there are the little babies that they sometimes make, but.
Yeah. So sometimes on Phalaenopsis and some on other plants as well, like Dendrobiums. Keiki is the Hawaiian word for babies. So they can create a little plant. Instead of a flower, they'll make a little bitty plant on the top. And once the plant reaches, if the little roots on the little keiki get to about 2 or 3 inches long, then you can cut that off of the main plant and pot those, and they should grow. But no, I haven't made my own keiki paste. You can buy it, so I buy it from people that you know, already know how to make it. So yeah, I tend to not propagate very much. I've done a couple of stem props on some Phalaenopsis back years ago, but yeah, no, it's a little difficult to propagate things that are the monopodal orchids unless they form multiple leads. Anything else?
Well, just there was any recommendations for dividing them?
Well, it kind of depends on the orchid. You can't really divide a Phalaenopsis unless it forms multiple fans. And some of them are clump forming, but you don't normally see those very often. So Cattleyas are one that you can divide because they grow sympodally. So the root runs along, the rhizome runs along the surface and new growths will form. So you can cut those, but it's recommended that you not divide them smaller than 3 growths per division. But they bloom a little better when they have a, 3, 4, 5, 6 bulbs rather than just 1 or 2, because it's a little bit more plant mass to feed, the blooms. Slipper orchids, once they get big and form multiple fans, sometimes they self-divide in the pot, but anything that has smaller than 2 growths, 2 fans, really has a hard time regrowing or propagating. Yeah, but
okay, I think that's the end of our questions. I've got a survey I'm going to put in the chat box for you all, and I'm actually going to go ahead and stop our recording.